Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Matthew Algeo, the author of When Harry Met Pablo, Truman, Picasso, and the Cold War Politics of Modern Art. He's written 7 books now and has lived all over the world as his wife serves our country. Matthew, thank you so much for being here. For your second appearance on this show, this will be episode numbered somewhere in the 140s, and you were here in January of 2021 when we recorded episode number 30, and I thought that was a lot, and here you are again at 140.
That's more than 100 since then, so I'm glad you remember me from way back on episode number 30. Thanks for having me back.
No, it's my pleasure. Your book, The President is a Sick Man, is right on my shelf. I see it every day. Before we start, I want to invite our listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Aside from the fact that they were giants of the 20th century, Matthew writes that Harry Truman and Pablo Picasso could hardly have had less in common. One was a communist. One couldn't stand communism. One dropped an atom bomb. The other dedicated art to stopping war. One was a womanizer. The other was devoted to family. One was exceedingly rich. The other wasn't. But I want to ask, first of all, have you thought at all about the similarities between being an artist and being a politician?
Wow. I always hate to say, I hate it when people say, that's a good question, but that is a good question.
Thank you. I love hearing it. You can feel free to say it as often as you want.
Yeah. That's a terrible question.
Yeah.
There are similarities. I think if you look at their personalities, Picasso and Truman both knew how to work a room. And I think politicians need to sell themselves. And I think artists, to be honest, need to sell themselves. I mean, nobody sold himself as an artist better than Picasso did in the 20th century, probably of all time. Same with Truman. I think he was able to sell himself as a politician, and he certainly proved that in 1948 when he defeated Dewey in that election. So, yeah, I think there are things that these guys have in common. I also like to think, Truman and Picasso being in the same room together. Well, Truman was rarely in a room where he was not the most famous person, and Picasso was rarely in a room where he was not the most famous person. So they have something in common right off the bat when they get together. They're both very famous, and they both know how to sell themselves.
Your book is centered on a single photograph. It shows Harry Truman in a suit and Pablo Picasso in a casual blue button-up vest, it looks like, at least, with a blue undershirt. The picture was taken in June of 1958, just over 5 years since Truman left the presidency. They were at the front door of Picasso's hilltop mansion in France. They shook hands in that photograph. They are shaking hands in that photograph. How did you decide, and when did you decide that this photo could be the premise for a whole book?
Okay. The photo itself sort of began making the rounds about 10 years ago or so. I follow a lot of Harry Truman content online, as one does, as Harry
as
Truman
everybody does, right?
as your Google News alert in the morning.
Right.
What has Harry been up to? But yeah, I do follow a lot of the Truman related social media accounts. And about 10 years ago, this picture started popping up. I think it was around that time that the library digitized it, and then it went online. And I had not been familiar with it. And so, I saw it pop up from time to time, and I thought, well, I mean, it would strike any of us as unusual to see Truman and Picasso shaking hands, anybody who knew anything about politics in the 1950s. And so I actually began an article. This began as an article for White House History magazine. And it was one of those stories where, the meeting between Truman and Picasso is interesting, but it's sort of what leads to that, what led that to happen, the backstory. It was one of those stories where the more layers you peeled back, the more you found and the more you wanted to research and find out more. So it goes all the way back into the history of modern art and how modern art was weaponized during the Cold War, that sort of thing. And so I figured it deserved a little more than just an article.
How concerned were you that there would be enough sources, that there would or wouldn't be enough sources to make a book out of it.
Yeah, it's a concern. And there wasn't a lot of firsthand information about the meeting itself. And you'll see in the book, really, the first half of the book is we're kind of looking at modern art in the United States and the politicization of it. And then the second half is really kind of about the Truman's trip, culminating with the meeting with Picasso. Now, I was fortunate in a couple of ways. One was that the Trumans on this trip were accompanied by their friends Sam and Dorothy Rosenman. Sam Rosenman had been his White House counsel. They're two retired couples going to do a Mediterranean cruise. Sounds good. Well, Sam Rosenman was an avid amateur photographer. So there are actually a lot of photographs of this trip. And I was able to get in contact with the Rosenman's grandchildren and was actually able to use some of the photos in the book that have never been published before. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I have some questions about that. But how is it possible that even David McCullough's allegedly what they call, and I call it, an authoritative biography of Harry Truman didn't include this meeting in it?
It's well, I guess it goes to show how eventful Harry Truman's life was, right? If you or I had ever met Picasso, it probably would have been the most memorable event of our lives. To Harry, it was just another day on his vacation, and so much happened. And I guess that's one of the reasons I really like these smaller stories and using them to try to tell bigger stories about the people and the politics of the time. But it really was one little incident in Truman. I'm sure if Truman were alive today, he would say, "Why the hell are you writing a book about the day I met Picasso?"
5-second meeting, right.
But really,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, and the AP wrote this short little brief on it, which I thought was so funny. Like, oh, and by the way, all the world news aside, Harry Truman and Pablo Picasso met.
Yeah, and we'll get into it. But the guy who orchestrated this meeting was Alfred Barr, who was the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art. And so I think he saw symbolism in the photographs. But by the time the meeting occurred in 1958, a lot of, modern art had by then become more mainstream, I guess. And so it was important symbolically, I think, for Truman to meet Picasso.
So what was Harry Truman up to after he left the presidency? Obviously, he has a tremendously eventful presidency, the Korean War, desegregating the military. He literally is the only person in history to authorize the dropping of an atomic bomb. World War II ends. There's a number of international things going on. Segregation is ramping up in the United
UN segregation. Yeah.
All these things are happening. So what is he up to as he cedes the stage after this eventful presidency and has to figure out what to do with the rest of his life?
Right. So he leaves office in 1953. And I'm sure, Evan, you've read my book, Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure.
Right? It's on my list, but I will read it. Absolutely.
I'll be back for that.
Because I've read 9 or 10 books on Truman. Why not make it 11?
Yeah, he's good fodder for books. Well, he took a road trip in the summer of 1953, and he didn't have any Secret Service protection. The president's got no pension. So he really was the last president to kind of return to something resembling a normal life. When he retired, he didn't have a lot of income. In fact, this trip he took in the summer of 1958 came just as Congress was debating the first Presidential Pension Act, which passed and gave presidents an annual pension of $25,000 a year.
And a number of presidents moved to New York. Richard Nixon did, Herbert Hoover did, Bill Clinton did, Barack Obama was in Washington. I'm sure he has a place in Chicago at this point. Donald Trump, of course, went to a big setup in Florida. This guy is just from Independence, Missouri. It's unbelievable. He went back. It
wasn't until I believe it was when his mother-in-law died that Bess and her siblings took ownership of the house on North Delaware and Independence. And then Harry and Bess bought out their shares. That was the first time Harry Truman ever owned a house. It wasn't until after he was president, and that was the only real estate they had. So he really had no choice but to go back to Independence. He had nowhere else to go. He wouldn't monetize the ex-presidency. He wouldn't take huge speaking fees. He wouldn't take seats on corporate boards or become a spokesperson. I mean, you go in the post-presidential papers at the Truman Library, there are all these letters. A letter from a soap company that wants to make Truman soap, stay clean with Truman soap.
I would
So
buy that.
I would too. I'd buy anything with Truman on it.
Yeah.
But he really went back to something like a normal life. And I think this trip they took in 1958 for them was very extravagant. Although I will point out that the owner of the shipping company, the company that he sailed to Europe on and back, was the widow of a former ambassador, one of his former ambassadors. And when she got wind they were planning this trip, she offered them free tickets, and they gladly accepted. So he wasn't. He would take a good offer when it came.
I wasn't sure there were people who viewed art, even who would spend less time looking at art than I would. It's not that I don't enjoy it, but I just don't find myself drawn to it on a daily basis. Explain. I loved reading this. How did Harry Truman view art?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, that was interesting to me. I hope people find it interesting when they read it, but I kind of focus on Kansas City, which is where Harry's growing up in northwestern Missouri, in Grandview and Independence. And then he moved to Kansas City when he was a young man. There was no art museum in Kansas City. William Rockhill Nelson, who was the owner of and publisher of the Kansas City Star newspaper, he went on one of these grand tours in the 1890s or something, went to all these museums in Europe and thought Kansas City should have pictures like this. Of course, Kansas City couldn't afford to buy one of the old masters. So at the time, there would be reproductions made of all the famous old master paintings, all the great works of the Dutch and Renaissance painters and so forth. So he purchased a bunch of these. He put them in a gallery on the second floor of the public library in Kansas City. It was called rather grandly the Western Gallery of Art. Everybody called it the Nelson Gallery. And that was probably Harry Truman's first exposure to any visual art. There was no visual art in his home growing up that I was able to find out about. And so his idea of art very much followed William Rockhill Nelson's. It was this realistic, it was the classic Western art of correct perspective and proportion. It was almost photographic. These pictures were so lifelike. And that was the art that Harry Truman came to know and came to love. And so when modern art comes in, the Armory Show in New York in 1913 is the first big modern art show, and there was a review in the Kansas City Star about it and the reviewer said, these artists are crazy and everybody's laughing at them, that sort of thing. So that was what informed Harry's opinion about art.
And there's a Seinfeld where I think George goes, "What is it? It's just a bunch of squiggly lines."
Yeah. Any 5-year-old could do it. That was Harry. Harry called it ham and eggs. I think he thought it looked like it should be on the breakfast plate.
For Picasso now, how did Pablo Picasso view politics? What do we know about his views of the political scene as he is, I guess, entering the later stages of his life?
Sure. So he actually joins the Communist Party of France. I forget the date, sometime right at the end of World War II, I believe, and issues this big manifesto about why he believes in communism and the Communist Party and that it's the future. But I like what one of his biographers said was Picasso belonged to a party of one, Pablo Picasso. So although he sort of went through the motions of supporting communism, and I mean, he was a member of the Communist Party, he seemed to have no particular, I don't know, investment in it. I think he supported it almost like a hobby. The U.S. took it very seriously, and the FBI kept a file on Picasso because he was a communist, and he was part of anti-nuclear groups that were largely seen as Soviet front organizations, that sort of thing. So, Picasso was a communist, and but he really wasn't until Guernica that you really see any sort of politics in his work. So he was a latecomer to politics at all.
Give us a primer on his life. We know tons about our presidents on this show. We've done a ton of episodes featuring a number of them. Harry Truman, this may be the third or fourth episode on Truman, but how old was was Pablo Picasso at this point in his life? And I guess aside from that, how did he capture the world's attention? Who was this man?
So he was born in Spain. His father was a sort of a minor artist, never got into the big academies, sort of, I guess you would say, went to the B or C level art schools, made a modest living as a portrait painter. Picasso moved to Paris when he was young. And his early training was in classical art. I mean, he could draw. And when you look at the early sketches he made, even as a boy, they're pretty amazing. Very realistic and lifelike. But after he moved to Paris, he went through a period where he began moving away from realism. He was a self-promoter, really, from the beginning. As far as his age, I should point out, he was I think he was 3.
You said 3 years before Truman.
Yeah, 3 years older than Truman.
Yeah.
And then they died within 6 months of each other. So their lives almost perfectly paralleled. So in 1958, they were both in their 70s. But, to make a long story short, Picasso kind of invented, no, I'm not an art historian. Everything I did the research. I have a friend who vetted the book. I majored in folklore. So that's the extent of my art knowledge. But he really invented modern art. He invented the idea of self-promotion, really. He invented the idea of changing perspectives. Cubism was really his attempt to draw a picture from all four sides. Let's not just draw the front. Let's add the sides, add the back, add the bottom, add the top. But it's on a two-dimensional surface. So he was really inventive, and he was a genius. He had a genius for art, and he had a genius for promotion.
And where did he live? Where was he born, and where did he grow up?
He was born in Malaga, Spain. I'm probably mispronouncing it, and spent most of his life, though, in Paris, although he remained a Spanish citizen. So he kind of floated between Spain and Paris. Eventually, he settled in the south of France, which is where Harry and Bess visited him. He didn't really travel very much. In fact, I don't know that he ever flew in a plane. He didn't like to travel. There's a funny story at the end where somebody asked Harry if he would be inviting Picasso to the United States. And Truman says, "We do not invite communists to the United States." But I don't think Picasso would have come. If he did, he probably would have come by ship. Apparently, he was very afraid to fly. But he spent most of his life in Paris. And that's really he made his name and his fortune there.
So you discover this picture. Well, at least you see this picture. You're inspired to write about it. You're wondering how much there is to digest and to build a narrative out of. What exactly were your sources beyond these photographs that you were able to find that had not been published? How did you start piecing together a narrative, and what archives did you tap for this project?
And it was tough because this began during the lockdown. So I kind of began working on this in the summer, fall of 2020. But I have to say the archivists and researchers, the research assistants, the librarians at the Truman Library and the Museum of Modern Art in New York really made this possible. They were able to make scans of files and send them to me, put them in Dropbox, that sort of thing. I really, really kind of hit the mother lode at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, with their files on Alfred Barr, who was the founding director. And as I went through there, I realized that it was he who had set up this meeting between Truman and Picasso. And I also learned, in fact, that Barr had been trying to convince Harry Truman of the value of modern art for a long time, as far back as 1947, at least. Shortly, just 2 years after Truman became president, Barr sent Truman a book about modern art, hoping to, sway him. It didn't succeed, but Barr never gave up. And so that was part of the background, was this idea that Alfred Barr is trying to set up this meeting between Truman and Picasso. And it's a really kind of a diplomatic achievement to pull it off.
Did you feel comfortable? You've written about Truman, you've written about Grover Cleveland, you've written about a lot of really nonfiction and sort of big political ideas. Did you feel comfortable wading into art, given you're not, as you said, a trained historian of art?
No, I did not feel comfortable at all. And I have to say, I have a friend, Jess Squire Ruthier, who is an art historian, is on the board of, I believe, on the board of the Association of Historians of American Art. She helped me a lot. So I would kind of sketch out what I had learned, and I don't get too deep into the woods on history of art, et cetera, but it's a big part of the story. And she helped me out, but it was a learning experience for me. But that's part of the fun. I mean, you're researching the book, you want to learn something. It would be a little boring to just keep researching the same thing over and over. No offense against Robert Caro, who was one of the greatest nonfiction writers, but I don't know how you could live with one guy for that long.
Well, he's still living with him. I'm hearing all sorts of rumors about when this next book might come out.
What is it? Book number 4 we're waiting
on. Book 5. No,
book
4, 5. Yep. I wait every day hoping for an announcement.
Well, you got to get him on.
Let me tell you, I could end the show right there. I could do that episode and say bye-bye.
But anyway, it was definitely, I felt at times that I had bitten off more than I could chew. But, I was able to hone it down, and I think it makes sense. A lot of it is just telling stories about the different controversies about art and just being able to give enough background so people understand what's going on.
So one thing I'm not comfortable with is foreign policy, and I'm not comfortable with, I don't know a whole lot about history of the rest of the world. I'm embarrassed to say that. It's just a fact. I found myself drawn to American history. Of course, there's always intertwining, particularly with our country. But once we go overseas, I'm a little uneasy with what I know and my ability to talk about it. So I'm curious, how much did your wife's career as a foreign service officer, and the only reason I'm saying is because on your website, but how much does her career and your life of moving around impact your ability to grasp the research and the storyline as it related to a Pablo Picasso and this meeting they had on what we would consider foreign soil?
Well, for this particular book, it was really helpful because at the time we were posted in Sarajevo. I believe that's where we
interviewed you. Yeah. We talked with you there. Yeah.
So researching the trip on that side of the Atlantic made it much easier because we were able to drive. We did a road trip and drove from Sarajevo through Slovenia and Italy, and then went to the south of France. We were able to stay at the resort hotel where the Trumans stayed, which was very cool and partially deductible. And I told them, why I was there, that Harry Truman had stayed there. And we were at dinner one night, and the maitre d' or the concierge came and brought a book, and it was their autograph book of celebrities who had stayed at the hotel. And Harry Truman was on page 1 because the hotel had just opened when Truman was there.
I said, sign this, we'll use the book. Yeah.
Right. And but then they had there was Mel Brooks was in there, and Art Garfunkel. They had all 4 guys in Pink Floyd signed all over on the page. It was so cool. So in that way, there was an advantage to being in Sarajevo. And of course, like I said, it was, for part of it was during lockdown, so archives were closed here anyway, and so I was kind of dependent on people being able to send me stuff.
You went from Grover Cleveland, you've done pro football, you've done an obscure sport which I'd never heard of called pedestrianism. I think that's what. You did a book on Lincoln, you did a book on RFK, You did a book on a road trip Truman took, which I promise you I'll read. How did this book flow from all the other books that you've done?
You know, I really I love the Harry Truman stuff. I really love that era. I think the 1950s, that I guess we look back on it fondly. I'm sure if you were living through it, it wasn't always fond, but that era of the Cold War, there's so much interesting politics going on. There's so much happening that's really shaping the world we live in today, from Europe, Russia, the Middle East, Africa. I talk about in the book, there's the rebels in Algeria are fighting the French, and de Gaulle comes back into power. So it's really it's almost like my comfort food, kind of going to that place. And the other thing that's cool about it is you'll often find that there are still people alive who can give firsthand memories. And there's also usually plenty of archival material. Newspapers are easily accessible, that sort of thing. So it's a little easier period to write about than, say, the 19th century. So it was just a story that it grew kind of after I started writing the article, and kind of, it was during the lockdown, it became my hobby, and then it became a project.
All right, back to the narrative here.
Yeah.
A little bit. So what were the particulars of Truman's trip? What did this itinerary look like?
So he and Bess and the Rosenmans, Sam and Dorothy, May 26, 1958, they left New York. They sailed on the Independence, aptly named, a ship that took them first to Naples and then Genoa, and then they went to Cannes. They stayed in a resort hotel. I mentioned Chateau Saint-Martin near Vence. They spent, I think, a total of 3 or 4 weeks, and then came home on the SS Constitution. So what happened was Sam Rosenman was a law partner with a guy named Ralph Collin, and Ralph Collin was on the board of the Museum of Modern Art. So that's my theory for how Alfred Barr heard that the Trumans were going to the south of France. And that got the wheels turning in Barr's head to try to set up this meeting. Otherwise, it was a pretty ordinary vacation. They went sightseeing in Naples and Genoa. I have the obligatory, Mr. Magoo, Harry Truman kind of scenes where he, bungles his way into a wedding in Genoa and helps push the car when it gets stuck in Italy somewhere. So it kind of mixes in aspects of what is really a pretty ordinary Mediterranean cruise with this extraordinary incident with Picasso.
And I thought it was cool that he didn't travel with security, and that when he ran into what you would call locals in each stop, they were really thrilled to meet him. I think that's cool.
He really enjoyed that. I mean, he really liked people. As we talked about earlier, there was no Secret Service at the time. That didn't come in until 1963. So yeah, he traveled largely without any security, although there were a couple of times, I think, when the mayors found out he was in town and would send somebody out just to keep an eye on him. Don't want Truman to die in your town. Just make sure he gets across the border. He could die in Monaco. But yeah, and people recognized him. I think by now, early in his ex-presidency, he thought he could just travel as an ordinary person, an ordinary citizen. By now, he recognized that wasn't always possible. So, but he loved just interacting with people. And I think he had an interesting. Somebody talked about Picasso, how even if you didn't speak a language in common, and on this trip when they had their lunch and they spent the day together, Picasso's partner, Jacqueline Roque, she kind of acted as translator, but Picasso could still connect with people. People talked about this. Even if they didn't speak the same language, he could connect with people. And I think Harry was the same way. I think he had that gift. He really could just connect with people, even if he didn't speak the same language. So it was kind of cool for him.
There's a part of the McCullough book where McCullough describes how Truman was, sort of a simple country boy who found himself in the U.S. Senate thanks to patronage. And even as vice president, he only had one guy with him and a driver, and that was it. And he becomes president, and he's kind of like, wait, how many people do I have to travel with? I have an actual army with me.
Right.
And that was unsettling for him at the beginning.
Well, it was unsettling for the Secret Service at the beginning because they'd been protecting a guy who couldn't walk for 12 years, right? And Truman, when he got his first check as president, got up and started walking to the bank, First National. And the
I
Secret
remember that
Service
story,
finally,
yeah.
caught up with him and said, "You can't do that.
You can't cash your check. What is
Right.
wrong with you?"
So yeah, it was a big adjustment for Truman. It was a big adjustment for the Secret Service as well. I think Truman didn't like the security thing. Like I said, he liked people, and I think he didn't like a barrier between himself and people.
So how is this meeting arranged? Explain as much as we can. Put together how
Yes,
we've got to put these two guys in one place.
So I think what Barr did, I know what he did. Just as the strategy was to convince Picasso that Harry Truman really wanted to meet him, and then convince Harry Truman that Pablo Picasso really wanted to meet him. And so when you read the letters and the correspondence, it's always, Mr. Picasso would very much like to meet you, Mr. Truman. And then Truman's like, well, Picasso really wanted to meet me. And then Barr, he sent a letter of introduction with Truman, and then also sent it to Picasso. And he explained how Picasso didn't like visitors. He could be very prickly. But Barr had really helped establish Picasso as a major force in art in the United States. And so I think Barr cashed in a few chips here by convincing Picasso to meet with Truman.
And what was, do you believe the biggest reason he just said this meeting's got to happen?
Well, in the book I go into it, but the backstory is as early as 1946-47, there was a concerted effort to suppress modern art in the United States. This largely came from Republicans on the far right, although I hasten to add at the time, both the Republicans and the Democrats had liberals and conservatives in the party. There were wings of each party. So this was the right wing of the Republican Party at the time. In fact, some of the left wing of the Republican Party, Jacob Javits in particular, were staunch defenders. Nelson Rockefeller as well, staunch defenders of modern art. There was a congressman from Michigan named George Dondero, and he was kind of the wingman for McCarthy when it came to modern art. McCarthy being Senator Joseph McCarthy of McCarthyism fame. And so McCarthy was a big red baiter. And Dondero, for some reason, just got it in him that modern art, was like a Trojan horse kind of thing, that this is what communists were going to use to infiltrate American culture, American museums. He threatened to cut funding from museums that displayed modern art. He even named critics who had reviewed modern art favorably and called out their newspapers. So he was very much anti-modern art and wanted to suppress it. Now, Truman hated modern art. Hated it.
Ham and eggs, is that what you said?
Yeah, ham and eggs. Any 5-year-old can do it. But, and this is one of the things I love about Harry Truman, although he didn't personally enjoy modern art, he saw value in it. He appreciated that others saw value in it. Okay. And so he had no interest in controlling or suppressing modern art at all. He hated these guys who were doing that. So that's the backstory. I think Alfred Barr, who had himself been in Germany in 1933 when Hitler was rising to power, he was afraid this was repeating itself in the United States, and he thought it would be symbolically important for Harry Truman, who was a very vocal critic of modern art, but to break bread with Picasso would send a message that modern art was not dangerous. Modern art was not intrinsically evil, that sort of thing. So I think Barr appreciated the symbolism of these two men getting together.
And you said that you go into it in the book, and I don't want to give too much of it away, but what do you want to say on this show about what the meeting actually entailed? So Truman walks up, and does he just knock on the door and Picasso come out? Explain as much as you want to without giving it all away, so people buy the book.
And I'll be honest, there's not a second by second transcript of what happened, so it's really pieced together from the recollections primarily of Dorothy Rosenman, and also we know kind of how Picasso was. And Truman himself told a few stories about meeting Picasso as well, so he was on the record about it. Visiting Picasso was a real trip, man. He had a big mansion up in the hills in Cannes. I think he was a hoarder. I mean, he saved everything, which was great, for his heirs when he died. There were plenty of Picassos sitting around. So the house was kind of a mess. My favorite story about Truman and Picasso, Truman visiting Picasso's mansion was Picasso had a goat named Esmeralda, and Picasso loved this goat. He would draw crazy cubist pictures of the goat, and he made sculptures of the goat. The goat was allowed in the house. The goat could come and go as pleased. So Picasso was apparently showing Truman around, and Truman saw the goat out on the yard and saw one of the, crazy pictures Picasso had drawn of the goat. And Truman said, "You mean to tell me you took that beautiful animal out there and turned it into this?" And he said Picasso turned on his heel and left. I don't believe that part. Picasso was never afraid to debate or confront somebody. And one of Picasso's favorite stories, and I think it's the kind of thing he would say in reply to that, was, a lot of GIs would visit him in Paris after the war, after the liberation. And he would come and show them around his studio. And he said some got it and some didn't get it. And of course, they would say, yeah, but it doesn't really look like a goat. And then when they were leaving, he would ask them if they about their wives or girlfriend. And inevitably, the GI would take a tiny little picture out of the wallet of his wife and show it to Picasso. And Picasso would say, "Oh, but she is so small." And the GI would say, "Oh, no, that's just a photograph."
That's just a picture. Yeah.
Right. So, the point being obvious. So I think they engaged in some good banter. I think Truman later said he enjoyed it. He was a lot of fun. Short, bald guy, a lot of fun, he said. So I think there was actually something very homey and touching about these two opposites coming together like this.
And how long were they together for?
Well, this is another interesting part of the story. Originally, they were only supposed to go to Picasso's for lunch at his house, but when they were done, fortunately, Dorothy Rosenman recounted that Picasso had apparently enjoyed spending time with them so much, he offered to take them on a tour and show them around the south of France, show them some sights. And so they ended up spending most of the day together. Of course, Picasso being Picasso, he took them to sites that were primarily about Picasso. But nonetheless, it was a very rare display of hospitality on Picasso's part. So it was notable for that.
I thought it was, just fascinating that Truman is trying to send a message by having this meeting to politicians back home. What was the point here? What was the goal that Harry Truman had in making sure that, people back home were aware that this had happened?
I think he was trying to basically give the finger to far-right Republicans, especially in the House. This goes back to 1946. In the book, I talk about it. There was a modern art. The State Department put together a collection of modern art that it was going to send overseas to show people how America was a land of free expression.
Yeah, I was interested. The CIA was promoting art overseas.
Right,
that's fascinating.
right.
Yeah.
And but this exhibition that the State Department put together in 46, 47 became very controversial. Had a picture in there of Circus Girl Resting, it's called, by Yasuo Kuniyoshi, and it sort of shows a rather large woman, sitting backstage at a circus, and people said, well, this looks like she could play for the Chicago Bears and stuff like that. It was just horrible kind of stuff. But it became so controversial, and it was controversial mainly because the State Department actually purchased the pictures, which they argued was actually cheaper in the end because then they wouldn't have to insure them, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, Look magazine did a big display. Your tax money paid for these pictures, and they put all these crazy pictures up. Became a huge controversy. Finally, Truman had to kill this whole exhibition, said, bring it home, sell it as government surplus, don't want anything to do with it. I think that's something that stuck with Truman. Like I said earlier, although he disdained modern art, he held nothing against artists, the people who made this art. And so I think for him, it was kind of an expression of that, a support for the artist, if not necessarily the art.
Not sure what the status of the Picasso mansion is, but did you get to visit the site of where that meeting would have been?
I did. I sent letters. It's actually one of Picasso's daughters is in the mansion now. I sent letters in English and French and
Every language you could think of.
Everyone, the Picassos could not be reached for comment. But I did drive up there to see the outside of it, which is basically looking at a wall and sort of seeing the roof over the top. And I got a few looks from, the gardeners and the help outside, and
I'm writing a book, but I'm writing a book.
I'm safe. I'm not. Yeah. Just knock on the door.
Yeah.
So I didn't get in there. I did though. It was cool. I went to the museum they visited, which was at that time the Grimaldi Museum, and is now a Picasso museum in Antibes. And there I emailed the director, and he showed me everything. It was pretty cool. Picasso spent a lot of time there in Antibes working, and then they gave him space in the museum to work, and then in exchange he gave them a bunch of art, which of course was a pretty good deal for the museum.
Yeah, no kidding, right? All right, there is a movie called When Harry Met Sally.
Right.
Who came up with the idea for this brilliant title, When Harry Met Pablo?
As far as I know, you can't copyright a title, I will say. So there's no intellectual property has been stolen. I guess it was sort of a natural. It was sort of the working title from the beginning, and just nobody ever came up with anything better. It just seemed
there isn't anything better. I'll tell you that right now. What did you learn about how society and even governments have to promote arts in the year 2023 from researching this book?
It's really interesting how the Soviet Union dealt with art. In the early years of the Soviet Union, there was a blossoming, this flowering of modern art. Some of the greatest modern artists of the first 2 decades of the 20th century came from Russia. And then in the 1930s, of course, when Stalin takes over, he basically kills that. Stalin only liked pictures that represented real things. If you showed him a picture of, an abstract picture, he'd say, well, where are the people?
The squiggly lines. Yeah.
Yeah. He didn't like that. And it says something that there's so many layers to this, because while in America, artists could create pretty much anything they wanted, in the Soviet Union, they could not. But in America, there were still hurdles that the artists had to overcome, public perception, that sort of thing. And so I think, it's still there. We're still doing it. They're banning books. I mean, you're in Florida, right? I mean, we're still facing this. It's such a fraught subject. And when you think about art, you don't think it should be so fraught, but there's something about it that really affects people, I think, and in a real, like on a gut level. And I think we're still dealing with some of the same stuff today.
Which artist of today do you wish Harry Truman could meet? And it doesn't have to be a painter or even a visual artist.
Wow. You should have given me these questions ahead of time.
No, because then I don't get these responses.
Okay.
You tell me don't ask that.
Yeah. Or I'd have the most clever answer prepared, which I don't.
Yeah.
I didn't expect to be sandbagged here. I really
I don't mean
think
to put you on the spot.
Harry was musically inclined. I should say Harry was a good piano player. And that's one thing I want to say about Harry not liking modern art. He was not uncultured at all. He loved Chopin, could play it very well. I really think it would be interesting to get Harry together with some of the, modern recording artists. I think that's the one place you might be able to get him to come around. He was in 1958. It's just when I think the Quarrymen make their first recording. So you're just beginning to see the first stirrings of rock and roll. And I'm sure, I don't even know, would Harry have heard any of that? So I guess I would say, maybe a musician, maybe a jazz musician. As far as visual artists, I don't know. I think so much of it today is really similar, and I'm not to sound, I don't know, it's still kind of derivative of it. It either is so crazy, like the banana taped to the wall or the blank canvas, that I don't think Harry would find much still yet to appreciate in contemporary art. But I think in contemporary music, you might be able to convince him.
Yeah, like let's get him together with Notorious B.I.G. or something like that.
I
Right?
was trying to
wish
think.
we could, right?
I didn't. Yeah, but there are some interesting. I really
Taylor
think.
Swift.
Well, I'm
Maybe
thinking
not,
like, is it Snoop Dogg?
There you go.
I think those guys would kind of hit it off.
I love it. I love it. What's a piece of art you find yourself just staring at every time you see it?
Well, right now I have to say it's Circus Girl Resting, which is that piece that was very controversial in 1946 when it was part of the State Department exhibition. And
I'm Googling it right now.
Yeah, it's Yasuo Kuniyoshi. And he did a series of Circus Girls. And Kuniyoshi is a guy, I don't know if we have a minute to talk about him, but
sure.
he was one of the stories kind of that was that I came across that, it just fascinated me. So Yasuo Kuniyoshi is born in Japan in 1889. He emigrates to the United States in 1906. He was 16. He goes to Los Angeles, attends public school. He intended only to learn English and then return home to be a translator. But when he's in school, one of his teachers notices he's very good at art, tells him you should go to art school. He does. He moves to New York and becomes one of the most famous modern artists in America. In fact, in 1952, he was one of 4 people chosen to represent the U.S. at the Venice Biennale. Had the first was in the first major show at MoMA of American contemporary artists. But because he was born in Japan, he could not become a United States citizen under U.S. law at the time. And in fact, when he married his first wife in 1919, she lost her citizenship because an American woman who married a man who was not eligible for U.S. citizenship lost her citizenship. Nonetheless, he considered himself a very patriotic and loyal American. During World War II, he was considered an enemy alien, but he did work for Office of War Information, propaganda posters, Japanese language propaganda broadcasts, that sort of thing. So finally, 1952, the Immigration Act of 1952 ended race-based criteria for citizenship, for naturalization. So he could apply to become a naturalized citizen. But he died 3 months later before the application could be approved. So when he died, he was stateless. And it's all on in his paperwork in the archives, like the papers filed with the IRS. So I think it would be really cool if Congress would pass legislation to grant Kuniyoshi posthumous citizenship. And that could also symbolically represent all the other people born in Japan who lived in the United States and contributed to the United States for that first half of the 20th century that were never allowed to become citizens. It was just a really fascinating story. Again, a sort of a tale of the time. Their passport, I have a picture of their passport in the book. Harry and Bess traveled on the same path. Bess didn't get her own passport. She's on the amendments page in Harry's passport. Woman was First Lady of the United States. She's still like second class status on the passports. Just
that's crazy.
Things like that you go back. But like I say, that's such an interesting area. It's so era. It's so transitional.
Yeah,
you're still seeing things that are just very 19th century that still haven't sort of withered away.
Yeah, my wife and I got married in 2019, and we went to the Vatican for our honeymoon. We went to Italy for our honeymoon, and we went to the Vatican during our honeymoon. And I just found myself staring at the Pietà.
Mm-hmm.
How does someone do that with stone?
Yeah.
Incredible.
It's the old story about the kid walking by and sees him. How did you know it was in there? How did they know it was in there? It's amazing. We lived in Rome, actually. One of our tours was in Rome, and they have these monumental relics. It'll just be the foot, from a statue that must have been 30 feet tall, and the foot is 4 feet long, and every detail in it is absolutely perfect. And you just think of the human, the skill and the ingenuity to just know how to create something like that. But that was the thing, Harry, he said, a great work of art takes infinite care, infinite work, and that was the thing that really rang his bell.
Do you have any idea what you're going to do next for a project?
No, man, come on.
Sorry.
This one just came out.
Sorry.
Everybody with the what are you going to do next? No, I don't. I don't have any idea. I mean, I don't know if I should say this, but sometimes I think I watch a lot of true crime. And, I think like being a writer, like writing these books is sort of like being a serial killer. Like after you finish one, you go, I'm never going to do that again. Right. And after a few months, you're like, well, maybe just one more. But anyway, I don't have any ideas right now. We're moving in July to, we just found out our next assignment's Botswana.
Wow.
So we're going
Ever been there?
No. And I go to places where I have to look up what the capital is after we learn where we're going. Gaborone would be the answer there. So we're going to be there for 3 years, but it looks like a really interesting place.
Wow.
And
3
it's
years.
English.
That's a big commitment. Wow.
Yeah, it's English speaking. So hopefully there'll be some stories there, but you never know.
We'll
it's
find
hard
out.
you got to really, man, it's like dating somebody, you got to be committed to live with a story for 3 or 4 years.
Matthew Algeo, the author of When Harry Met Pablo, Truman, Picasso, and the Cold War Politics of Modern Art. Thanks so much for being here.
You are welcome, Evan.
Check out the book. Check out his website, malgeo.net. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.